Have you ever accidentally spoken another language out of nowhere? Being a mixed child comes with its own problems. For the first 23 years I didn't know that bari is a Gujarati word for window, which in Hindi is khidki. I just thought they were synonyms. I always said the former while talking Hindi. No one corrected me because whoever I used to talk to knew both the languages. Until my husband came in my life. The first time I said, "Bari band karo," close the window, in front of him he told me to repeat. When I did, he asked me what the hell is bari. I kind of just asked him how much Hindi does he know. Went on to tease him. Oh boy. When the truth came tumbling out, I understood how stupid I had been. Turns out too many words had mixed up from Tamil, Marathi and Gujarati in Hindi when I spoke. At first my husband would just say, "Hindi please," and I would Google the word. 6 years later, if I do the same, he just stares at me and I fumble for my phone. There were days I have patted him on his shoulder and said, "Bijou bowl." So anything else, in Gujarati and those intense eyes, would make me crawl back in position. When my daughter said "Aiga" or "Mom" in Marathi, I realized how much mixed words I am carrying around. So accidentally spoke in another language, you ask? Every damn day. So, I had an oral examination a few months ago. I mean, an actual language oral exam for my O-levels. It was a Bahazan Layu oral exam, and the language is something that I'm utterly hopeless in. I couldn't string a sentence together if it cost me my life. And even worse, it's my country's national language. I blame myself for neglecting this skill. If I had it, I wouldn't be that worried about getting into a college in this country. But hey, at least I can speak basic Chinese and fluent English. Anyway, I sat down for my orals, and since this was the exam that defined my future, yeah, Mom, you told me that for my PSR exams too, I was extremely nervous. I kept fiddling as the invigilator read my IC, etc., and I was trying to guess what my topic was, if it was going to be easy or not, etc. I kept rehearsing my name and trying to think of things to calm myself down, but I was clearly never going to calm down until I get out of here. I was shaking too. The invigilator asks me, "Are you nervous?" in Malay, to lighten the mood and calm me down. You know what I answered? "Yeah, I am. But I just want this over with pretty normal." Until you realize the person I'm talking to is Muslim and I just spoke in Chinese. I don't think I'm going to pass that oral exam. I very clearly recall the first time this happened to me. More correctly, I recall the reactions of the people around me, but I don't recall the phrasing itself. In middle school, I was probably 12. I often went home after classes with a good friend and her family. They were Lebanese and spoke a few different languages at home. While they always spoke English to me, they'd often use Lebanese Arabic with each other, especially if something was urgent or I was not directly involved. I don't recall ever making any attempts to learn the language. I was preoccupied with learning other languages in school, but I suppose I picked up some things incidentally. One afternoon, my friend's mother walked into the house with arms full and called out for her son, "Where's Pete?" Name changed. Without looking up from my homework, I called back, "He's on the computer in the back room." I went back to focusing for a few seconds before I noticed an odd stillness in the room. I looked up to find the entire family staring at me in shock. Having no idea what had happened, I just stared back, glancing desperately between faces for clues. My friend finally broke the silence. She asked that in Lebanese. Her little sister chimed in, and you answered in Lebanese. I was sure I'd heard and spoken English, and I could not consciously tell you how to say either of those phrases in Arabic. My entire recollection of the event is in English, though I was, admittedly, distracted at the time. To be honest, to this day I'm not 100% sure the entire family didn't mass hallucinate the event. I've got a fun story. I'm from the US but ended up living in Brazil for 8 years. When I moved back to the US, I only had the odd Portuguese word or phrase crop up once in a while for the first month. However, there was one instance in which I just started spouting off Portuguese without being aware of it. I was in a park and came across someone with their dog. I asked if I could pet it, and I immediately turned to the dog and started speaking Portuguese to him. I called him over and told him how beautiful he was and the usual things you say to a dog all in Portuguese. It didn't even occur to me for a good 30 seconds that I was speaking Portuguese. I suddenly paused, looked up, and asked the other person if I had been speaking English. He just shook his head. What happened is that I had never lived with a dog in the US. Furthermore, while I was in Brazil, when I was dating my ex, I lived with him and his schnauzer. I absolutely adored that dog, and spent 2 years with her. Every time I see a dog, especially a schnauzer, my first thought is still in Portuguese. As a high school, middle school student from the Netherlands, being native in Dutch, learning English, German and French and Latin in high school and also learning Swedish apart from that, it can get quite confusing sometimes. Dutch and English are the languages I speak best, followed by Swedish, then German and last a very little French. The ones I get confused by most are German and Swedish, sometimes sounding pretty similar. Living near the German border, I am quite often in Germany, and sadly not many Germans speak English. Looking like a normal Dutchie, and therefore also like a German, Swede, Norwegian and all other Nordic Germanic people, I get quite often confused for a citizen originally from one of the previously named countries. Especially when I am in one of those countries myself. In Germany this means Germans start talking German to me quite often. Last summer, when my Swedish was finally on a level of normal conversation and my German was worse than ever, not having used it for quite some time, and not taking classes in it in high school anymore, I visited Germany again. This time I made a biking tour with 2 of my friends. We were about 200 kilometers over the German-Dutch border and we were somewhere in the countryside. A German, who was a tourist in his own country, was lost with his car, and randomly stopped his car on the middle of the road, which was quite busy for a random road on the countryside, to ask us the direction to a village nearby. Assuming we spoke German, he asked this in German. I, understanding that he probably wouldn't speak English and wanting to quickly handle this situation, tried answering in German. I took out a map and started to point out the way while talking in what I assumed was German. Finally done with my whole description of the road he had to follow, I looked up to him and saw his totally confused face. Then I looked to my friends who don't speak Swedish and also only a little German who looked evenly confused. The man said, "Vielen Dank," and got back in his car. My friends, still confused, "What the hell did you just say?" in Dutch. And it was then I realized I just gave a complete route description in Swedish. I was proud and very confused at the same time. Yet, several times to be honest. When I was working as a cashier in a fuel station, when I just finished dealing with a bunch of foreigners, I spoke in English to them. So, the customers after them was just locals. Then, after scanning their items, I accidentally told them the total price in English. It is quite awkward since I might sound like an arrogant pseudo-westernized brat. But never mind that. Happens at the same station. There are some items that we are not able to scan. So, we have to enter the barcode manually. So, when the price comes up, I pronounce the price this way, for 6.75 instead of casually 36 ringgit, 75 cents. It is not another language, but it is still somehow an alien language, since my brain was twisted to pronouncing the displayed number only. One more trivial case is I accidentally pronounced some number like 4,675 to customers. This sometimes happened after dropping big cash into the safe. This one is when I was doing practical at the National Museum. Was having conversation with a couple of Russian. When we are dismissing, the mother asked his son to say spasiba, thank you, to me. However, for a reply I should say ani za что позалюбista, no. I replied Dorian, French instead. That happened since I just joined a talk full in French by a French I study in a lab with students from many countries. Coming from Thailand and studying in Japan, I can speak Thai as a native, English as a semi-professional, and Japanese as a beginner. At some point, I managed to get myself tangled in, like 4 projects at the same time, with different groups of teammates. One day, while I was discussing something with a colleague from Mac in English, a Japanese student approached and requested to talk with that guy in Japanese and then with me also in Japanese. At the same time, a Thai in turn asked me something, so I replied to him in Thai. Because I was the center of everything and clearly required to be present in all 3 or 4. How should I count this? I tried to maintain my language in a particular conversation, to not bother the other party by forcing English on all of them, by speaking Thai to Thai, English to the Mac dude, and Japanese to Japanese. Before my brain decided to say fuck it, and started shifting the language without my consent. I suddenly turned to speak to the Mac guy in Thai, spoke to the Japanese guy in English, and to the Thai intern in Japanese. The intern could not speak any Japanese at the time. Everyone, including another Japanese bystander, all burst out laughing, and pointed out that I finally snapped. Clearly, it demonstrated that I was totally incompetent at managing and keeping cool. No, but I've had it done to me. I used to work with a 70-year-old Basque French guy named Michael. I'm not even going to attempt spelling his last name. If you know anything about Basque culture, you know it was at least 15 letters, 3 of which were K's. He spoke English okay. I was his sous chef, but it was a 2-man kitchen, so it was just us. I was about 28. We would be working, and he would gradually slip into French during service. I know a normal amount of kitchen French from years working in restaurants, so when he would start up with les haricots, plus le pain, I could keep up, and eventually, invariably, he would look at me and fire off some long sentence. I would always be like, chef, no French. And he would look annoyed and say, sorry, I forget. Nice old guy. Miserable job, but at least we both hated the owner, so we were a good team. And he taught me a lot about cooking. Bonus tip from Michael. Put a little oil in your chopped garlic. It will prevent it from getting dried out and sticky. Put a little white wine in your chopped shallots. It will prevent them from getting oxidized and getting that old onion smell. Also, put a big scoop of butter in everything. Yes, but the best would be this. Once, when I was playing basketball with my friends, my mother called to tell me she was going to the store. Obviously, they decided to try and give my mother an odd idea by yelling interesting things in the background like most friends do. The only problem was that, since she was in the car, the signal wasn't great, and since we were outside, it was already loud, so I couldn't hear a word of what my mother was saying. I generally switch between Canada and English while having conversations with my parents, and in this particular scenario, I was speaking in Canada. I kept trying to get my friends to tone it down a bit, but they just got encouraged and screamed louder. Eventually, after asking my mother to repeat herself for the 4th time, I snapped and yelled on du nurmishabai much and direka golwa. Nanager nu kane still rumath of irajo. Some naya. Can't you shut your mouths for a minute? I can't hear a word they're saying. Just stop. Into the phone and politely said, sorry, could you please hang on for a second, to my friends. It took me a comparatively long time to understand what I had done while my friends howled with laughter. I had a lot of explaining to do later. While looking into a database corruption error with my colleague Erling, who is Norwegian, we were looking at a problem with data coming in, where the values just didn't make sense. This was fairly common with the application in question, but we worked out that if we could recreate what database query it had actually run at the time, and reran that query, we could usually deduce what nonsense it had come up with as a result. On this one occasion it returned empty set, that is, no matching results. We both sat side by side at this computer monitor, in utter disbelief, and, for whatever reason, I uttered the word ingenting. This was a word I had learned on a holiday to Norway in the 80s, where I made a semi-serious attempt at learning the local language. Ingenting means nothing, not only in Norsk, Bokmål and Nynorsk, but in several other Scandinavian languages, like Danish. I think it was the fact I said it ingenting, with the massive emphasis on the fact that this query had returned nothing, and that this represented a new kind of wrongability that neither of us had encountered with this shit bill of code previously, that freaked Erling out the most. I virtually uttered the thought that was running through his, much more bilingual than mine, brain at the time. I honestly cannot remember why this stupid code had done whatever it did on this occasion, but, for whatever reason, I had spoken the words right out of another person's head, in his native language, which he was temporarily thinking in, at the time, while we were both sitting side by side at a computer monitor, trying to debug an error we both had to deal with. Forgive me if this is a vague memory, but it did happen when I was 5 years old. I was in kindergarten, and if you've read any of my previous answers, you know that I was raised by my off-the-boat immigrant grandparents and mother until the age of 7. Keep in mind they spoke very little English at the time. I forget what we were doing, but I remember trying to ask another student a question. I was speaking Italian instead of English, and of course, rightly so, everyone laughed at me. Heck, even I let out a few chuckles. Soon after, I accidentally started to speak to my teacher in broken English, half of my speech in English and the other half my native tongue. There was one more occurrence. It wasn't out of nowhere, but there was this one really bratty boy who called me a tutor in Spanish class. I looked him in the eye and started to rant about how much of an idiot he was, mostly in Spanish, while incorporating a bit of Italian here and there. What sucks is that after my mom and I moved out of my grandparents' house at age 6, I began to lose the ability to converse in Italian. Nowadays I can only remember tidbits of the language, but for some reason I can fully understand songs 75% of the time. If the language is spoken to me, I can get a rough idea of what is being said. Yes. One time, in the US, I received a random phone call. I picked up and said, "Привет," hi, in Russian, instead of hello. Then, I spoke in thick Russian accent and added "sika blyat" at the end of several sentences, asking him to transfer money, or else. The random caller had acquired a great fear of this Russian on the other end and so quickly gave me his credit card number. I, needing not to be arrested for fraud, hung up before he could give me the CVV digits. It does turn out that the caller knew a Russian who called and spoke rapid Russian. I said, "Hello, who is this?" And the Russian caller switched to English and said, "This is Boris. You called my friend a bit aggy," I said. "This is Agent Davis with the FBI. I believe you have acquired the wrong phone number. This is a private number and this call will need to be investigated." And the Russian hung up. Such was the end of a strange experience.